let's get started then. We have a very, very good panel, and we have tight time restrictions, but we'll manage as best we can. Okay, so let me begin, first of all, with Hafsa Omar Abdullahi, who is the Director of the Climate Change Department in the Ministry of the Environment and Climate Change in Somalia. Hafsa, you're very welcome. The first question I would put to you is, you've just heard now Sarah's presentation about climate mobility in the Greater Caribbean, but how many of those findings would resonate with you in relation to your own country, in relation to Somalia? I mean, what does climate mobility look like from a Somalian viewpoint? And if you could just say a few words about that, I'd be very grateful.
Thank you very much, moderator. Good afternoon to you all. I'm Hafsa Omar Abdullahi from Somalia. I'm the Director of Climate Change Department at the Ministry of Environment. And thank you all. Also, thank you for having me. And thanks for your presentation. It was very articulated. Thank you again. But if I go back and link how Somalia climate mobility and what lessons can we learn from Caribbean climate mobility. First of all, I came from a country that climate change affected most, and although we are the least contributed countries around the world. So climate mobility in Somalia, and in 2023, we joined an Africa Climate Mobility Initiative with a partnership of an Global Center for Climate Mobility. So we launched a climate mobility deep dive in Somalia in 2023. And that document or that plan, it will be a strategic plan that we wanted to use around 5 years. So it is highlighting how we get the knowledge of climate change, climate mobility, and how they're related, and also how to use it in climate mobility as a tool for resilience. Because Somalia, around 3.2 million, they displaced since 2020 until 2023. So the most devastated event that happened in Somalia was El Nino in 2023, which caused the destruction of livelihoods around 1.3 million people that displaced and internally in Somalia, or some of them sometimes, specifically the youth, they are taking some dangerous steps to go over the seas. They are using illegal immigration, some of them, and they died in the seas. Like Somalia, I can say, for the last 2 weeks, and every 2 other family or every 3 other family, they have sorrow because they lost their youths. I cannot mention what we are feeling from different regions in Somalia or our social media posts. Everyone is saying, and this lady or this young man, he graduated the university 2 years ago, and now he's dead in the oceans between Algeria, Spain, and those. And you can feel it, how the climate change affected Somalia. It affected our economic, our stability. That's what causing sometimes to use a mobility for the tool of resilience. So I always thank to the Center for Global Climate Mobility, how they are supporting us as a government to understand and how we can use climate mobility and deep dive. So I can say that deep dive involves how we can get the knowledge. We started some consultations inside Somalia. We highlighted the spotted area, specifically that migration have been according to the climate change. And Somalia's governance, it is a federal state or federal member states. So we go down in a deep stage to the areas or the regions that the migration and displacement have been. So in the current realities, and according to the researches or the documents that we prepared together, government of Somalia and our supporters, international or national, since 1990 and 2023, over 30 million people of Somalia and climate change affected, whether drought or floods, and that's caused every time that the number of displacement is increasing. So also, the most strategic thing is 80% of that displacement people is women and children, because they affected climate change the most. So all these climate change, it causes food insecurity, climate insecurity, and when the resources become less, there is a conflict inside the region which causes many problems. But nowadays, I can say the government, with the support of the centers or other institutions, we are trying to understand the problem. So if we get the problem, we can find the solution. So also we started 2024 some consultations to the youth, academia, government, local communities across Mogadishu, Baydhabo, and Dhusamareb. Mogadishu is the capital city of Somalia, and the other two cities are two capital cities for some FMS. So they participated well, and we shared the information how we can solve it together. So let me share with you some takeaway that we get from that and consultation is, and we understand Somalia that need is like internal or local adaptation and led initiatives to understand and how we can solve our solution is also green skills program is durable solution is also the government of Somalia is and we established again office of the durable solution that works closely to the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, and also we did community awarenesses and campaigns. So I can say the lessons that we learned from Caribbean and what we are doing now is some related, and we will get more back. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hafsa. I turn now to Julia Blocher, who is the project lead at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Julia, you're very welcome. I mean, based on the research that you've been doing, particularly around habitability and climate mobility in Africa and Asia, what does climate mobility look like to you in 2025? And what are some of the key findings that you've made from your research on those issues?
Thank you, Ambassador Donahue, for the question, and thanks again to the Global Center for Climate Mobility for the invitation. I'm truly honored to be here and to be part of this discussion. And thank you for the question. In response, I think I'd like to highlight three key trends. These are areas where mostly scholars agree and have been agreeing for some time, but areas in which new insights and techniques in 2025 really allow us to deepen and refine our understandings. So the first key trend I wanted to share is that context and local perceptions are really central to mobility decisions. And I think that we have long understood this. This is almost self-evident, but we are today now much better at capturing this. And this key trend really relates more to the local and national level, for which there's generally consensus that people's perceptions of changing climate and of environmental risks that they're experiencing are central to their own decisions about migrating, about at what point do they become displaced or must be evacuated, or their decisions about staying in place. Our empirical evidence increasingly shows that environmental changes, often exacerbated by climate change, affect mobility both directly by disrupting livelihoods, especially in agricultural settings, as we heard from King Letsi, as well as indirectly by influencing other migration drivers such as economic factors, demographic changes, and also political conditions. So we know that the capacity to move is also socially differentiated, and by that I mean it's shaped by sex, age, socioeconomic status, position and status in the household, and much more. And thanks to recent progress in data and methodologies, we're now much better equipped to trace these context-specific webs of causality for climate migration or climate mobility through fine-grained and multi-site qualitative research in particular. These mobility decisions are deeply rooted in how people experience and interpret their environments and the changes they're in. And these perceptions and experiences don't always align with what we see from weather station or satellite data. This implies, in a way, that climate mobility is often nonlinear. For example, my research in East Africa has shown that households may stay through smaller events like minor income loss, but then may decide to move after a severe event like a flood, as we heard from our colleagues from Somalia, or the accumulation of multiple and recurring shocks over time. Migration may become perceived over time as a more effective or feasible strategy as people are constantly reassessing their capacities and as conditions evolve over time. So that's the first key trend. A second is more at the global level, which is that new modeling that we're working on these days, and we heard a lot already from Sarah Rosengartner about that. This new modeling opportunities are showing how climate change is reshaping international migration patterns as well as migration transitions. We've had many years of case studies and now meta-analyses on this, but we're really now facing leaps forward in quantitative modeling and attribution science. And I wanted to highlight recent attribution studies done by my colleagues at the Potsdam Institute using simulated scenarios with global climate models, as well as some of the scenarios for macroeconomic growth that were already presented by Sarah. And these attribution studies show that climate change has likely inhibited global migration over the past 30 years by slowing economic growth in many parts of the global south. These studies have showed that this slowed economic growth has likely prevented many countries from reaching those income levels at which international emigration tends to accelerate and then later decline. This is a process known in academia as the migration transition. So if we take these historical attribution analyses into the future, this would imply that some countries that today are relatively poor may experience high emigration pressures for longer because climate change is keeping them at lower or middle income levels for a longer period of time. So those parts of the global south may remain in a high immigration step of the migration transition for longer than they would have otherwise. And all of this modeling research that is ongoing challenges this still common narrative that climate change will simply increase international migration in a linear fashion, and this we know not to be the case. The third and final trend, if time permitting, is about tipping points and perceived thresholds for migration. This is a really promising area of work in 2025 that is central to the idea that climate mobility is not just shaped by those gradual changes occurring over time, but can also be triggered at tipping points. And I think that we've accepted really in the climate science space that climate impacts are nonlinear, but yet we have still many migration studies that focus on the gradual effects of existing migration, of climate change on existing migration, or I think as Sarah said, use the term familiar routes. So I would say in order to inform actionable policy, we now need to better understand when and at which point and how do people decide that moving away is no longer an option, but really necessary or even inevitable. And that tipping point will be different for different people because capacities are different. So this is all leading to our exciting new research on social tipping points and perceived thresholds. In other words, the moments at which households and people decide that where they're living is no longer habitable. So if you would take one message away from my intervention, I would like it to be that climate-related mobility needs to be understood as a fundamentally non-linear phenomenon. So those tailored, locally relevant and flexible policy solutions need to be developed, and perhaps with the new science and tools that we're developing, as well as the political will that appears to be growing, as we've heard in a number of times today already, inspired by the first inaugural Berlin Climate Mobility Forum, we can better respond to this climate mobility phenomenon in a way that reflects its complexity. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Great, Julia. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. I have to say that for me, it was always an article of faith that that migration would actually promote growth, whereas you're saying, in effect, that it can sometimes inhibit growth in the global south. Very, very interesting. We have time for maybe just one further question. Are there, I mean, you said that it's a non-linear process, so I think that's a point well made, but are there particular areas of knowledge that we don't yet have in relation to, or areas of insight in relation to climate mobility? Are there sort of areas that you would like to extend your research interest into?
Sure, thank you for the follow-up question. I think just to double down on the point of social tipping points. I think what we're really interested in and also investing in a lot is bridging the physical sciences with the social sciences to better understand that point at which a place was habitable and is now no longer habitable according to the people who live there. And this will help us to better ensure that migration can remain a choice. If we understand how to identify and describe habitability, then we can better ensure that people can migrate as a choice and not as a matter of survival. And I think we heard from King Letzi earlier that people make strategic decisions for a dignified life. We heard from His Excellency from St. Kitts and Nevis that migration should be a choice and not a matter of survival. So we're investing a lot in allowing researchers in ways that really weren't possible before to look at the physical impacts of climate change and what makes a geographic space survivable, habitable in that sense, as well as understanding from nuanced social science research, qualitative studies, what makes a place, so not just a physical space, but a place embedded with human meanings that would also allow dignified livelihoods and also communities to stay together and thrive as a whole. So if I can take one short example, we recently finished fieldwork in 6 countries in Africa and Asia. I think it echoes nicely actually what Sarah presented earlier. We found that women, by and large, were able to explain to us more adaptation options that they would have, including migration. So they had more options on the table in a sense that the creativity was there. But then when we asked how would they employ these options in the future, if they had employed them in the past, they were much less likely to have actually been able to act proactively to face climate change, much less likely to have been able to use a mobility strategy to face the impacts of climate change. So I think we trying to bridge together what we know about from climate science with this nuanced understanding of human settings and also describing, for example, things like the role of gender roles in constraining people's adaptation.
Great, Julie. Thank you very much. I turn now to Nazreen El Saim. Nazreen is a Sudanese activist and climate activist and youth leader. Nazreen, a couple of questions, if I may, just to start off. When you look at the climate crisis and the prospect of ever increasing displacement, what are you most concerned about and why? What is the biggest concern you have straight off?
Before I answer your question, I just want to also note that I'm a former Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow, which is the most important, as Kwame mentioned earlier.
I'm one too, so I'm delighted to meet you.
Yeah, so what I'm really concerned about is that we have marginalized communities, and we have, even within the marginalized communities, we have even more marginalized communities. In the past few years, and including my work here as a fellow and my project, was thinking more of the nexus of climate change, peace and security, and how countries in conflict are even more severely impacted by climate change. And I just want to give 3 examples of countries in conflict that are severely impacted by climate change, but they have like this double effect because they are already impacted by the conflicts. And I will start with my country, Sudan. Sudan is having the worst humanitarian crisis in the world for the past 2 years because of the war. And last year, in 2024, we did a study in 5 states in Sudan on the impact of climate change on the internal displaced people who had to migrate and be displaced because of the conflict. And the lack of information results to us that only 15% of the population said they are impacted by climate change. Only 15%. Although scientifically we know the numbers more, but this is how they felt themselves, because climate change doesn't happen only in crisis and sudden. Sometimes it also happens in slow changes. So you get used to it, and you naturally adapt to it with time until a crisis comes and then what you call it a tipping point. But before tipping points, there are gradual changes that people normally adapt to. Only a few months later, so we finished the study in April 2024. In July 2024, we had one of the most devastating floods also in Sudan. And the area that was flooded was bigger than Germany in size. And we had already before the flood, we had 9 million IDPs because of the conflict. Unfortunately, 2 million IDPs again happened because of the conflict. So instead of having only 9 million, we had 11 million IDPs because of climate change. Even worse, all of the IDPs camps that were already installed in places were flooded, all of them. So even the 9 million who had to migrate before because of the conflict had to migrate again because of the flood. And everyone who started to rebuild a life or semi-life, something to just continue with, had to lose everything again and had to move again. So when we redid the survey, again, after a few months of the flood, we found that some people had to migrate 3 times or 4 times, and as many times as you migrate, you became more vulnerable to everything, economic, I mean, many, many, many things. So this is one of the examples. And even worse, that we had a cholera breakout because, of course, of the war and everything, and all of the cholera isolation centers were also flooded. So you can imagine how much outbreak of cholera we had afterwards, because all of the medical waste, all of the patients, all of the water was basically contaminated. Let's move to another country, Chad, which is our neighbor. I also had the privilege somehow to talk to some of the young people who was once part of Boko Haram, and they all told me somehow that they indicated it, that the main reason of them joining Boko Haram was actually because of Lake Chad, because it's shrinking and they are losing their livelihood. So for me, the other alternative of them crossing the Mediterranean to Europe is to joining extreme terrorist groups, which is, I don't know even what's worse. I cannot even compare between the two options. I want to give another example, which is Bangladesh. Bangladesh, 1/3 of Bangladesh will be lost because of the sea level rise. And Bangladesh is an agricultural country that is populated. So now, until now, we don't have a definition for climate migrant, and UNHCR does not recognize climate migrants in a very institutional way, okay? So normally, political refugees, for example, are able to go back to their countries when the political situation changes, because political situations are changeable. But what about countries that goes under the water, people who will permanently lose their land and their houses and their homes, who really don't have anywhere to go to? So what are the solutions for that? And I think this is a huge institutional gap not to have these installments in place already for the future. Last but not least, and I think it is a very obvious example that a lot of European countries, including the EU as an institution, they find the best way to stop migration is militarization. And again, going back to my country, there was a very big process called Khartoum process, where the EU actually gave finance to a militia, which is currently fighting in my country and causing the war, to stop the borders, because Sudan is considered a transit country. So most of the migrants from Eritrea, from Ethiopia, from Somalia, from Djibouti, from most of the eastern side and the Horn of Africa passed through Sudan to go to Libya, then to cross the Mediterranean to Europe. And militarization is definitely not the solution, and I even don't recall in history where really military solved the problem without causing a bigger problem afterwards. So this is, I think, something we really need to talk about, because the actual solution for illegal migration, if there is something called illegal migration, I have many question marks on this term, is to provide enough reasons and resources and adaptation possibilities for people to stay in their places, because as if now, migration is not a choice. And for me, this is a very empty slogan for many countries, because simply migration is not a choice.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Nisreen. There's a lot you've given us to think about there, and you brought out the complexity of motives that, as you say, on one occasion might be strictly in response to climate change, that people move. On another occasion, it'll be more mixed with conflict in the background, etc. And it's good to be reminded of that. You're a very, we can see it here, you're a very effective advocate. Do you think that advocacy, how effective can advocacy be, and what sort of groups are you hoping to influence most of all? I mean, I was struck in particular by what you said about the EU and militarization. I mean, that's a very important issue. I also was struck by what you said about illegal migrants, whether that's a fair, whether there is such a category. I share your reservations, I have to say. But I'd just be curious to know, how do you see your own role as an advocate?
Define effectiveness.
That you see evidence of attitudes changing.
Yeah, so basically, as Kwame mentioned earlier, and I'm referring to you twice today, so we don't have the privilege of really being pessimistic. And I say this a lot when some people interview me and say, oh, what gives you hope? It's like, hope? Who said? We have the privilege of losing hope. I mean, I don't really think we have any other alternative other than going. But I think what makes the activism or advocacy effective at the moment is to, one, speak to other people than your normal audience, which is basically breaking the silos. And especially people, climate geeks like me, or nerds, if I may say, we tend to speak to the same circles of people over many, many, many years. And I think breaking the silos and reaching other communities is very important. That's one. And two, I think it's very effective when you say, dude, you cannot really burn my house and then give me $5,000 and tell me rebuild your house, because some things are not rebuildable. If I lose someone, I cannot rebuild that person. If I lose memories, I cannot rebuild that memories. If my mental health get impacted, I cannot rebuild my mental health. So not everything is really rebuildable, and really I think this is a very important notice for what they call it the loss and damage fund, because not all losses and damages are actually compensatable. This is very important thing. Heritage, culture, a lot of things that we normally lose in migration. And I'm saying it from an experience because I had to flee my house after the conflict in Sudan, only with a backpack full of diapers because I had a little son, he was 8 months old. And literally when I look, I feel like, okay, I basically lost every evidence that I existed before the day I migrated or I had to exile my house. So not everything is really compensatable. And I think last but not least, it's very important also to always point the elephant in the room. And I think this metaphor itself is so funny. I mean, elephant is a huge animal. If we really have an elephant in the room, it will probably be filling all of this space. So how can, as humans, we don't notice something so big to the point that we even make a funny metaphor saying that we don't see the elephant in the room? Dude, I don't see you, but I will definitely see the elephant in the room. And say, yes, we have to stop the fossil fuel. And unfortunately, a lot of communities are now even considering other options like the geoengineering, like the reflection of the solar ray, like cooling the water by breaking the Antarctica. I mean, and we don't even know if these new ways and technologies are good. But how would we know if we are always, as a global south, they call it, or at least even countries in conflict, we are always struck by our daily life of struggle of finding food, finding shelter, finding water, finding electricity, which is the most of the world now consider basics. So I think talking about science and knowledge and technology and climate finance is quite privileged where it should not be. Thank you.
Thanks, Nazim. Sarah, coming back to you for a moment on the terrific research that you presented earlier on, how are you going to use the findings from that research? Where do you go to from here?
Thank you, David. We are going down and up, if you so will. So we started with this regional initiative and are taking the findings both to the country level, so working with national audiences, both governments, but then also engaging other stakeholders in the country, And obviously not necessarily around the findings as they are there, but using the data that we have, using some of the insights that we have to start a conversation about the national context, and to see how that adaptation journey, I really like what Julia described, I think is very much captures this, what we describe as the adaptation journey, this idea that it's a process and there will be different moments of decision making, and at different points in time those decisions may shift and change. And so the idea is, how do we work with governments and communities at the national level to think about that process and how it can be accompanied, and not have a one-time decision or one-time plan, but really see it as something that needs to be a continuous process of engagement. And then at the same time, we also take the evidence up to fora like these and to other international conversations to support some of the messages that we heard this morning around the right to stay, around the need for frameworks that create predictability for people who are forced to leave, that protect their rights and their dignity, and also around financing and the need to step up support for countries on the front line, but also really make sure that money reaches the local level and the communities on the ground.
Thanks very much, Sarah. I turn now to Kumi. Kumi, thanks for your really inspiring remarks, I think, which had a big impact earlier on. How do you see the prospects for achieving a global agreement on climate mobility? I mean, we're going through particularly turbulent and unsettling times, but is this, I mean, you talked very movingly about the need for optimism. Do you think that a global agreement is achievable in current circumstances, or is it possible that we have to settle for a kind of more gradual approach?
Thank you. Firstly, I should say that when you said my contribution was stirring, I should make a confession. I flew from San Francisco to New York, New York to Frankfurt, Frankfurt to Berlin, and got to the airport at 9 o'clock. So if I was staring, I was just trying to steer myself up to make sure that I stayed awake. So if I was a bit too staring, apologies for that. So what I would say is that, you know, to put it in context, in 2009, when we were in Copenhagen, Frana remembers well, we went there with the slogan which said, we want a fab deal. Not a fabulous deal, but a fair, ambitious, and binding deal. But what we got in Copenhagen, and every year after that, has not been a fab deal, but a flab deal, F-L-A-B, full of loopholes and bullshit, right? And so, just to be clear, as head of Greenpeace for 6 years, and in other movements that I've been part of, many people here, you know, blood, sweat, and tears to get the Paris Agreement. So we are committed to get the best out of Paris. But it's clear that governments are not following what they committed to Paris, right? I mean, yeah, we're sitting in a country that we are supposed to projects itself as one of the climate leaders of the world, and they're still talking about new investments in fossil fuels, right? So, but your question about the prospects. So here's the good news. Okay, let me say this very cryptically, because there's one person in this room might get put on the spot. So all the leaders that sat here in the earlier panel, they are the leaders that are leading the fight, right? So we got 16 countries on board, 16 countries publicly announced. We have 17 countries, and one country is going to be announced next week at Bonn, right? So who's on board already is, we have 2 fossil fuel exporting countries, Colombia and Timor-Leste, East Timor. This has been driven by the Pacific Island states and now strongly supported by the Caribbean island states. And we have one large population-sized country, which is Pakistan, which has just joined. So that's on the governmental side. But on the staying with government, we also put a lot of focus on subnational governments. So we got more than 200 states, like California, for example, where there's a formal resolution by the state of California legislature, and we've got multiple cities around the world, from Kolkata to Freetown in Africa, Philadelphia, LA, prominent cities, London, the whole C40, for example. And oh, by the way, I was looking for you, Ralph. So I just want to pay tribute to Ralph personally, but to Tuvalu and Vanuatu for the leadership they've taken. They were the first two countries to step forward and say, we have to do this. If we don't do it, we're not going anywhere. So I just want to ask you to put your hands together for the Pacific Island states. So, how realistic is it? So, it's the treaty initiative is a top-down and a bottom-up way. So all I've talked about now is the top-down, right? But on bottom-up, it's pretty impressive. We got more than 2,500 civil society organizations that have joined, right? So it's the World Council of Churches. We can't call the World Health Organization a civil society organization, but the World Health Organization has signed one of the first signatories to say, from a health perspective, we need this. By the way, many other intergovernmental organizations within the UN system, I won't name names, were about to sign, but sadly, after Trump got elected, they said, hey, we'll work with you behind the scenes, but if we put our head out there, they're coming for our budgets and, you know, without naming any particular institutions. And we still continue to work with them, but behind the scenes, right? So also importantly, the alliance of banking institutions, 22 banks have joined, right? Including the largest mining company, one of the largest mining companies in the world in Australia. Somebody might know the name Andrew Forrest and Fortescue, right? They have joined, right? So what is needed now is for us to hold the global conference, just as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, they had a global conference on phasing out of nuclear weapons, and we are full force ahead to start that in between June and October of next year, most probably later, more closer to October. And that standalone phase out of fossil fuel conference will be the kickstart of the negotiations. But we'll be looking to Vanuatu, Tuvalu, and all the nations that have signed to give us the indication. The one thing that I didn't say, and Ralph, you might need to help me out here, in addition to the full endorsers of the process, there's already about 16 countries who have joined as observers. So this includes the Republic of Ireland, Nepal, there's 16. There are, sorry, several in Africa, like Kenya and so on, Malawi. And for the actual purposes of the negotiations, it doesn't matter whether people are fully endorsed or observers, they all participate in the same way. So I'll just end by saying that I just want to pick up, and I'll connect it. You made the point about how we talk, right? And I just appreciated that so much. Because I'm going to make a confession here. People like me have been part of the problem, right? Because we talk about climate change and aim all the narratives and the messaging at the brain, and we ignore the heart, the body, and the soul. We talk too much science, too much policy, too much, you know, most people don't know what we're talking about. How many of you here, let me ask you a question, how many of you here can go home and speak to your extended family, and most of your members in your family will understand what you are working on climate change? Don't lie. Some of you might be lucky. Okay, Farhana, I know that's true. Okay, a few. Look, I mean, you think about it.
My son doesn't understand until now what I do.
Yeah, so we have to actually start talking about it in a way that, you know, is inviting for people to want to join, right? And so unless we change the basis of our of how we approach it, I just want to end on the finance question. We must be very clear that we cannot rely on the governments in the global north who are inconsistent, double standard driven, and will shift money after having making commitments very easily. Like we fought so hard to get the loss and damage fund, right? After 15 years of fighting, we get the fund and we say, yes, we got the fund, and where is the money flowing into the fund, right? So therefore, right now, tactically, we have to look at private finance. So in September last year at the UN General Assembly, the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative pulled together 40 investment houses, and we have started a process of setting up what we call JEF, J-E-F-F, which stands for the Just Economy Forever Fund, right? And we are working with these institutions to try to direct resources to those countries that have stepped forward. So for example, Colombia says they got $40 billion in shovel-ready plans. And so we're working now to bring those private investors into Colombia to figure out, because for them, it's very different. They have to replace the revenue that they're getting from selling fossil fuels, right, by new revenue. Like say Iceland, for example, I just met with the president and the foreign minister to get them on board. For Iceland, everything is geothermal, right? The only fossil fuel dependency there is aviation and shipping, right? So when we go into the negotiations, and when the countries start negotiating, you might have clusters of countries that have high level of dependency on fossil fuels. They need to be put in one. So to summarize, 3 things we're asking for in the treaty. One is, given what we now know, there should be no new fresh investments in fossil fuels. Secondly, we need to phase it out as fast as possible. But there you'll go into clusters of countries depending on the circumstances. And third, to do it in a just transition way. Those of you, and this is my last sentence, those of you who are old like me might remember a movie with Kevin Costner called Field of Dreams. Anybody remembers Field of Dreams? Yeah. Huh? Few people. Anybody remember what the tagline from Field of Dreams was? If you build it, they will come. So we are quite convinced, once the negotiations start, right, the other countries that are not there will come, but we don't want countries like the United States, Russia, and so on to come now, because they will hold back the ambition. Thank you, and I apologize for that long response. Thank you.
Councillor Kumi, it's a great response. I mean, first of all, it's a wonderful initiative. I'm sure we all wish you every success with it. My question was a slightly different one, but perhaps it's for another occasion, and that is it possible to imagine a global treaty on climate mobility, in other words, where the countries would recognize, would acknowledge that there is this phenomenon and would pledge support of all kinds. This is probably a utopian dream on my part, but having been through something similar at the UN, I would like to think that might one day be achievable. But specifically,
can I just say it's achievable, but I would ask us to challenge ourselves, right? Because one of the weaknesses in our whole approach to addressing climate has been we have not approached it with an intersectional thinking and action, right? So therefore, I am completely open to the fact that in the way you negotiate a fossil fuel treaty, for example, to have a component that addresses this, right? Because if, you see, one of the things the powerful governments in the world like to do is to put us in little silos and get us negotiating, and people from the South have so limited resources to even send negotiators and so on. So in the end, you get outcomes that does not serve the majority of people on the planet. It serves the interests of the minority, and therefore we should be cautious about thinking, oh, we start a new negotiation, it'll be fundamentally good. It could actually backfire.
Good point. Nazreen.
Yeah, I just have to jump and point a small concern I have. So as maybe young people or young generation, we are losing somehow our faith in governments, and that's we are losing our faith in governments, and that's for very, very obvious reasons and how things are shifting at the moment. And this is not my only opinion. I founded a network of young climate activists from countries in conflict. It's called YALAB, which is basically Youth Alliance for Local Adaptation and Peace. And we currently have 36 members from more than 28 25 countries, so we have only one country out of the 27 countries that are mostly impacted by both conflict and climate change. And they all of them are saying the same things, that especially in these times, we need alternative governance structures, alternative to governments, because they are not delivering enough. And it is communities, it's people, it's NGOs, it's the civil society that is the first respondents, and it's the first advocates, and it's the first everything but the decision making on everything, on budget, on policies, on who goes to negotiate even. I want to remind you, when we had the first mention of fossil fuel in Glasgow, I was there, and the first countries who really objected on mentioning fossil fuel was not US, sorry, because it was Biden administration, but it was countries that from the global south, and I say they were agent of blocking for the global north, and it was basically India and Brazil. And Modi, the president of India, said that India will go carbon neutral by 2070. And I remember I met him and I said, "Hi, Mr. Modi, I really liked your intervention earlier and declaration that India will go carbon neutral by 2070, but do you think you will be there at 2070? And he had a moment of silence and he said, "Probably not." It's like, okay, why are you promising something? Why are you promising something that you know you will not be there to do, actually? Really, it's a very obvious question. So basically, in your treaty, where is the role of what you were part of for the many years, which is basically the civil society? Why this focus on governments at the moment where we know it's not, is it a lack of imagination where we can't even imagine a world where we have a government or governance structure, it doesn't have to be government, or militias, of course, because it's also concerned some sort of governance structures that really serve the highest purpose of us as people and the highest purpose of planet. Because when we talk about climate change, it's not only people, we're talking about biodiversity, we're talking about ocean, we are talking about the whole ecosystem of the planet.
Okay. Kumi, I'd like to give you, yeah.
So, absolutely right. So most of what we're doing is the bottom-up mobilization, which is civil society. But the problem we have is it is only national governments that negotiate treaties. So that's the only reason. But the question is...
That's the only thing that is happening right now.
No treaty, if you go in history, landmines, nuclear proliferation, all happened because governments wanted it to happen. It was because civil society pushed for it. So yeah, it's going to be the same. And even the international conference we think of next year, it will be a high level of civil society participation, but together with governments. And we hope also to have business, progressive business community to be there, because if they're not there, they will block us and kill us 1,000 times as well. But your point is very well taken. And I just want to assure you that once you become more active in the treaty after today, you will make sure that we actually do that.
I'd like to throw it open to the audience, and I already see a few hands perhaps David, if you'd, and maybe if you might introduce yourself just briefly, that'd be great.
All right, thank you so much for the conversation. And my name is Brutus Mbambi. I'm from Zambia. Yeah, so I'm part of the Fellowship for Young People under Global Climate for Mobility. And so when I hear climate change, what comes in my mind when my grandfather said, fighting climate change is like telling someone to stop smoking cigarette. We can talk about bad side of climate change, how it's killing people, and etc. So my question goes to all the panelists. You know, we are talking about phasing out fossil fuels, while there are other initiatives of carbon market that's coming in Africa, while other people are polluting, and we are buying people to offset carbon, to remove carbon dioxide. So if you were to be given power as scientists, are we going to fight climate change? Or if we give power to the politician, are we going to fight climate change by 2030 or by 2065? What are your perspectives on this?
Thank you. I'll take another couple if I may. Yes, please, here. Yeah.
Yes, Ali, as the Special Envoy for Climate Change from Maldives. Of course, you all know it's a small island country. So I think it was touched by Ms. Nisreen on your intervention as well. Well, for the researchers mostly, Of course, when the internal migration happens, then when it comes to small islands, we are really at a very disadvantaged position because our islands are, barely even 5 square kilometers, and that's really small. And that's one island. If it starts eroding, we have to go into another island. But then again, it's in the same situation as well. So how do you, is there any research or any findings on, what's the situation in this kind of, really disadvantaged position for this internal migration?
Okay, I'll take one more question. Just there was something behind. Did you? Thought there was one here. Okay, let's start over those two. Who would like to respond? Maybe I'll ask Hafsa. Would you like to come in, and then Nazreen? Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much again. And I can say, when you know the problem, you can find the solution. So according to the Africa or like Somalia, my people, I can say, even they don't understand what's climate change. So how do they know? And fossil fuel phase out, all these, because they don't know what is fossil fuel, what causes fossil. If we use the fossil fuel, what will be the benefit? So maybe 3 months ago, Somalia, we have made some exploration of fossil fuel, and everyone said, hey, and nowadays we will become rich. We were saying that in every family. But the other side, and as those who understand climate change, and what causes if we use those fossil fuels, when we share with them, that's not what the world is going on. They are surprising. They are saying, what's going on? So how the world is going back and forth. So I can say, it's very challenging to understand what's going on the North Globe and the South Globe. We are two different lines, like how the A and Z are different. For example, like our colleague, when he mentioned it, our family knows what we are working. I can say no. Last year, it was the hottest year in the record. And at that day, everybody calling me, Hafsa, you are the director of climate change, what's going on? and I'm saying, it is hot, take your fan. That is all the solution that they have. Because just I can say locally, or even the government, they don't understand. Whenever have been some disaster like floods, droughts, all the government institutions, they are calling the Ministry of Environment. So where's the early warning system? What? So, yeah, you can see how the world is different. So I cannot say much about fossil fuel phase out because Somalia is not part of that. So thank you.
Yeah. So regarding the phase out of fossil fuel, I think there is 4 key questions. One, is it a country that is producing oil or depending on importing oil is different. If you are importing oil only and not depending it for your own economy, then it can actually be, but it's actually more profitable even for the governments to phase out, because the prices of the other renewable energies is getting quite lower comparing to the prices of oil and gas, especially in this very turbulent world. We all know what's happening at the moment. But then there is other things, which is the technical transition from machines that are depending on oil and gas into machines that are depending on renewable energy. And of course, there is the nature of economy itself. Is it an industrial economy where there's a lot of heavy machines that we still have with a lot of renewable energy like solar? There is still, as they call it, efficiency problem. I also have some reservations on this, but it apparently doesn't give the same power and energy that burning the fossils does at the moment. So unless if you are a country where there is a lot of potentials for wind turbines and stuff like that, it's a bit of a problem. And then, of course, there is the oil and gas lobbyists within the country themselves, because there are people who have their whole industry and economy and wealth built on importing fossil fuel. And if you are a country that exports fossil fuel, then it's a totally different story. You have to find, as Kwame mentioned, other revenues to generate money. And it's a very long story, but it is possible, and it happened in many places. It just needs a lot of will, and a little bit of financial and policy strategy planning from the country. And regarding the alternatives for countries that will be underwater, I think, unfortunately, there is none. The only way is to go to somewhere else where there is no water. And I mean, physically, and I'm saying this as a physicist, you cannot really stop the rise of the sea level water if you didn't stop the global warming, because we are talking about the symptoms, but the disease is still there, and we are not curing it. And last but not least, the idea itself of the geoengineering that I talked about earlier, about reflecting the solar ray or cooling the water so it doesn't rise and stuff. We don't have enough information about it, and no one is really ready to invest in knowledge to really even explore these opportunities and questions. And a lot of people are skeptical about it. But I think the only good thing about the geothermal solutions is that there is no global north or global south. If it's happening, then it's happening for the whole planet. The only problem, if it goes wrong, then we are all doomed. But again, we are doomed anyway if the situation continued like this. So I think people really need to weigh their options and see how everything is possible, and don't stop fighting. And I really hope to get the opportunity to visit all the small islands before they disappear, because I remember I was watching a film, and one of the old ladies in the film said, I think we were the last generation to see the sky before of the satellites and everything. Because now you cannot say if this is a star or a satellite, but there was a generation when you can definitely say all of the things in the sky that are blinking are stars. And as a physicist, I say planets also shine sometimes because they get sun reflection, but that's a different story, astronomy lesson. So yeah, we really need to document the planet as it is now, because we'll definitely have changes. The question now is, how are we going to respond and accept these changes? Thank you.
Yeah, I want to refer to this morning's panel, where I think we heard actually quite a few things that countries are doing, and whether they're sustainable, durable solutions, I think is a question, but I think it's not like you're either fine or doomed. Like, I think there's a lot in between, right? Whether it's land reclamation, trying to gain higher elevation, making sure that there's statehood continuity so that legal right is there. But I wanted to share an anecdote, because I also feel like, of course, a lot of these solutions always cost a lot of money, but I love to go to the planetarium, and I take my kids to the planetarium. And recently they showed us a film about moon colonization. So it was all about like what's the time horizon for landing on the moon, and then establishing habitability on the moon, and then starting resource exploration on the moon. And then finally, we build an environment on the moon where there's actually some green and some plants, and it's actually going to be nice. And I walked out of there and was like, wait a moment, we have like a beautiful planet. So we could like spend now all this energy and time and money to have a livable something on the moon, but we can't spend that effort, time, and money to shore up small islands in the Pacific. Like, it makes no sense, right? And I mean, this goes obviously to larger questions around, how are resources distributed currently, and at whose disposal are investments being made. But I think this idea that certain things are not doable and other things are, and that is, I think, where my challenge is with concepts such as habitability, because who decides, where we invest to ensure habitability, on Mars or here, I know this is a polemic, but I do think sometimes it drives me a little bit crazy that our future, like our imaginations of the future, are so usurped by the tech utopians, you know.
Thanks, Sam.
Sorry.
Judy, would you like to come in on habitability on Mars or anywhere else?
I also love going to Epcot. Have a great, in Disney World where they have this hypothetical colonization of the moon. It sounds really far-fetched, but super fun when you're 10 years old. Yeah, the habitability, I think that the concept of habitability is a really exciting one because up until now we don't have a very good unifying concept in climate-related mobility, and that is my area. I'm not very familiar with fossil fuel phase-out and so on. I think if we're able to do a lot more to make sure that people's lived experiences are as important, if not more important, than what we see from the measured data from the climate models that are not very good and still and will never be probably very good at downscaling to the local level and really explaining how are people going to be impacted, how will families be impacted. So I think investing in habitability as a concept enables us to better ensure that migration can remain a choice. And I think this is an important conversation here today because at the end of the day, climate-related mobility is not just a question of the climate science, of the physical climate impacts. It's also really a deeply social process and one that's shaped by histories and perspectives and stories and narratives and also aspirations. And maybe my last thought, a really short one, is I was hearing from Nisreen about intangible losses and damages related to human mobility. And I've been spending a lot of time recently speaking with people around the world about this. And I think that these are some of the solutions that we should also be investing in. We already have examples of from previous relocations of people, from migration experience as well, like taking oral histories and writing them down, or investing in videography projects. If we don't do these type of things, some of this cultural heritage, things will fall out of living memory when people choose to or are forced to live a space. So we can have many different kinds of projects to ensure that we can address and minimize those intangible losses and damages of cultural heritage, as mentioned by Nisreen, reducing the impacts of mobility on collective trauma and mental health impacts, and a lot of other options that are available to us.
Thanks, Julia. Are there any further questions, challenges? Oh, there are a few, yes. Please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Suane Segovia. I'm part of the Center of Natural Hazards and Disaster Science based in Sweden. And I have perhaps a question or a comment. You will see. Thanks, first of all, to the panel for this great discussion, especially Nisreen for putting us back to the ground and trying to map in our heads what's going on there. To have more, perhaps, not only effective but meaningful solutions, and my comment is regarding this. So as we think about the alternatives to replace fossil fuels, it's also important to think about how the renewable energies, or so-called green energies, sometimes are also needing mining, for example, when we need to power like windmills and solar panels, and these at the same time can cause forced mobility, right? And there are many case in points. I've worked with the Sami people in Sweden, and as Nisreen mentioned, there is no global south, global north in this situation. So this can happen in Mexico, where I'm coming from, but also Sweden and so on. So if you have any comments about that, thanks.
Yeah, take another couple. There were one or two other hands here. Yes, please.
Asim Zia, and thank you very much for a fascinating panel, University of Vermont. I have first questions about the impact of these, both for, I think, Nisreen and Hafsa, about the migration leading to political regime shifts and tipping points in terms of like in Sudan or Mali or Niger or even Somalia, like in terms of like how would you characterize the contribution of climate change-induced extreme events leading to those political regime shifts in those places. And building off of that, my follow-up question, second question is for Julia and Sarah about the cascading interactions between, say, climate tipping points and the social tipping points. To what extent do you consider the political regime shifts can happen at the source of the climate impacts or distance from the climate impacts that can lead to political regime shifts? And what are their feedbacks in terms of the adaptive capacity that you, from Sarah especially, can you include those kind of, consider those kind of issues in the models that you have used to do the projections? Because in my view, like those kind of nonlinearities and thresholds can lead to a lot of uncertainty in kind of like understanding the model uncertainty. Thank you.
I think we can take a third one. Yeah, okay, sure, yeah. Please, yes.
So thank you, David, for giving me the floor. My name is Idi Nyang. I'm from Senegal, working at the Ministry of Environment and ecological transition. So this reflection is a bit critical for me because my country started exploiting oil and gas, and I was talking about fossil fuel and the impact on the climate change. And I know in my country, we are really impacted by climate mobility. So the displacement from rural exode, all young people who are living in the village, their main activity was agriculture. And with the drought and the desertification, they are leaving from the rural areas and coming to city, doing a small business, and when they collect a small amount, they are taking the boat and migrating to Europe. And added to this, the internal displacement with the farmers, for example. And we know that Senegal is a country opening with 700 kilometers to the ocean. And sea level rise, we know that many people are moving from the coast and to go to the hinterland. And these are many facts who the local community are already really impacted. I am from a fishing community, and I know all my community, they are living very close to the sea. And the impacts now that we know is very high. If you come to the first project financed by the Adaptation Fund, was one project in Rufisque and Sali. And that was to struggle the sea level rise and displacement of population. The impacts are there, and they are very crucial for population. We are joining this initiative from ACPI, for example. The study that we will want is maybe to see what will be in the legal issues, the framework that we can have to hand over this problem, which got linked definitely to climate change. That is the problem. So in the discussion and the negotiation, I was the first co-chair of the task force of displacement we had under the WIM. I was there. And now I am in the advisory board of Santiago Network. And the technical assistance we are looking for with the OBNs is we do not have yet organizations specialized on migration and displacement who can offer a technical assistance to parties to help them to have a national assessment. And that is the needed for countries to maybe ask for finance to the fund. How, in this kind of forum, can we guide countries maybe to develop at the national level politics and policies and technical assistance that can allow them to develop projects to ask for finance to the loss and damage fund? So that is my really concern.
Who would like to answer from the panel? Kumi, would you like to take that last question, or Nasreen, whatever you like?
Yeah, I think there was a couple of questions for me at the beginning, and maybe we can start with that. I think one of the things that we didn't talk about today, at least in the panel, is the communities that are mobile by nature, which is basically the pastoral communities that are mobile by nature. They move all the time. And this is the nature of their life, especially in the sub-Saharan Africa and many other places also in Asia and also in Latin America, where some tribes are border tribes. They don't belong to a certain country. They go to a certain area when it's winter. They go to another area when it's summer, and so on. A lot of problems and a lot of insecurities and conflicts start, especially in the sub-Saharan Africa, because of problems between farmers and pastorers. And this problems is because normally the farmers own the land and the pastorers pass by the land. Before climate change, there was an equilibrium situation where there is a win-win situation for the farmers and the pastorers, because there was seasons, and the seasons were known by time and date. And these seasons, the farmers know it and the pastorers know it, and they have some sort of a verbal, universal environmental agreement that the pastorers will only come after the farmers harvest, so the cattle can eat the leftover of the grass, and also cultivate the land, and also pesticize the land with the leftovers and so on. And then they move, and then the rainy season come, and then the new crops, and then it's again winter, so they move again south, and the process repeats itself. And currently, as we speak, there is nothing called seasons where I come from, on most sub-Saharan Africa. Nothing. It's summer most of the time. Rainy season are very irregular. All of the indigenous knowledge that people knew before and dependent on as communities are no longer there. So basically, one of the biggest flags at the moment is for the communities that are already in movement, because this movement are now longer than it should. They don't find water, they don't find land to eat, or the cattle eat the crushed crops, so the farmer killed the cattle, and then the pastor killed the farmer, and then the farmer tribe killed the pastor, and then the pastor tribe tried to take revenge from the farmer tribe, and it's a war. This is a lot of sparks happen at that moment. So I really think that most of the conflict-induced migrations in sub-Saharan Africa and other places where fights and conflict over natural resources is actually not political, even if the government's made it too by intervening in the wrong way. But it's actually not political. It's actually conflict over natural resources. It's an impact of embedding resources due to climate change. And this is one big category that people need to be open and clear and discuss it a lot. And there is other category where people don't have, or climate change doesn't have a lot to do, but it's mostly about power and energy, and then power and money, of course. And then people start to fight, and then other people or population have to move to other places. And then again, they hit by climate change, because climate change will not say, oh, this community is already having a hard time. They have conflict. I give them a break this year and I come next year. It doesn't happen like this. So again, climate change strike, and they find themselves in the face of lack of safety net because they don't have government. Government thinks that they have a big fish to fry, bigger fish than climate change, which is the war or the conflict, while we all know that the climate change is the biggest shark, you know. And then adaptation itself is a long-term planning system. We cannot adapt to climate change if we keep having interventions and we have cuts of finance, conflicts that destroy infrastructure, etc. Adaptation will not happen. And then definitely, if we don't have a government that cares, they will not go to negotiate the treaties or any other treaty. So the question is exactly not about the intersections about conflicts and people who migrate about conflicts and then climate change comes. The question is about the continuous marginalization economically, politically, etc., that leads to what they call it the perfect storm. A lot of countries have perfect storm of disruption of everything. And I think this is why we have this current network that we are working on. And and I think this intersections is very, very obvious, but a lot of people decide to ignore it. And currently the only solution is to build these local grassroots networks of people that can function even if the governance structure, which is called government, collapsed for any reason. Thank you.
Can I take the sister from Mexico? Huh? Yeah. So thank you so much for raising the point that you raised, because that is going under the radar. So we must be very careful that the very profit-driven motives that we see in the fossil fuel industry and some of the excesses that come from it, there's elements of that translating itself into the renewable energy industry. And the two very important things is, one is where they're doing concentrated solar and wind in indigenous people's lands without free, prior, and informed consent. So that's, we fought really hard to get that free, prior, and informed consent institutionalized, and we need to hold to that. The second thing is, especially when we're looking at what materials we need for the renewable energy industry, especially in terms of lithium and other rare earth materials, we see, like people in, say, Norway and other parts of Europe can feel really politically correct. We're driving electric vehicles, you can feel good about yourself, but when you dig into it and you see that actually some of the worst human rights violations took place to get those where child labor and so on. So I want to thank you and just say that that's a really important point, and thank you for raising it. And then the other issue, just to add to, so one of the dangers, brother, about what's happening with new resources being found in Africa, I mean, there's two things we have to be honest about, right? If we look at the history of fossil fuel extraction in Africa, right? So, what really aggravates many of us who have been in the struggles on the continent is when, like Tony Blair used to say, Africa is a scar on the conscience of humanity. I don't know whether any of you remember that thing, right? It used to just irritate us, because what we say is that Africa is the richest continent under the ground, and that's precisely why we're the poorest continent above the ground, what in the literature is called resource scarce, right? One of the dangers of getting tempted to go after deposits that are found right now. Firstly, it takes 10 years or 15 years sometimes, whether by the time you go through all the processes, by the time you get it up and running. What one of the scenarios you could end up is, a country like Senegal put all its eggs in a oil sorry, not all, but a substantial amount of investment in oil or gas. And then what happens is suddenly we see in Europe and in North America, they get hit by extreme weather events, and where the scale of human loss accelerates, and suddenly the whole thing shifts. And then we are sitting in the global south with what is in the jargon is called stranded carbon assets, right? We would have invested a lot and suddenly we cannot exploit it. So the last thing I would just say is intersectionality, right? When we approach these issues, because, I'm going to end with this, and this might be a bit controversial for some people, but ethically I cannot not do this. I mean, when we talk displacement, right, and people being internally displaced, it intersects with lots of different things, political stuff, historical injustice, and so on. And don't think the genocide in Gaza right now, which is the biggest displacement of human beings that we have seen on this planet, right, in a short space of time, is not connected to issues around environment. I mean, that conflict, water is central to it, but obviously that's hidden. It's not the major driving part of it, right? So we have to be thinking that when some of these displacements are taking place, it's not only driven by one factor, it's driven by multiple factors. And If we are smart, we will see the interconnections between them, because if we treat them as issues in silos, all of the issues will fail with. Only if we deal with them in an integrated way do we stand a chance of moving all those agendas forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Kumi. I think that probably brings us to an end in terms of the time we have available. Unless if there was some pressing comment from the floor, we could take it. But if not, I think we are going to have some concluding remarks from Minister Maynard. Right? Please, if you would take the floor.
Yes, please stay where you are.